She woke up to the soft light of the morning sun filtering through the curtains of the large bedroom. The room was enormous, decorated with taste and elegance, yet it felt cold, almost too perfect. Everything in the house was pristine, luxurious, and impressive, but it lacked warmth. She lay there for a few moments, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. Even in a house like this, she sometimes felt trapped, as if the walls themselves were keeping her from breathing freely. The sound of footsteps on the polished wooden floor signaled that he was awake. He walked with his usual precise, confident stride, the kind of step that demanded attention even in silence. She had learned over the years to anticipate his moods by the way he moved or the way his voice sounded in the morning. He was a man of power, influence, and wealth, and those things had a way of filling every corner of their life. Yet beneath that power, there was a sharpness that sometimes made her heart race with unease. He entered the room, dressed in an impeccable suit even for a day at home. The sight of him was both comforting and unsettling. She admired him in a way, for all that he had achieved, but she also feared him at times. He had a way of making even the simplest conversation feel like a test, a judgment. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. It was the kind of calm that could hide a storm. "Good morning," she replied softly, sitting up and brushing the hair from her face. She avoided his gaze, as she often did in these quiet mornings. Breakfast was prepared in the kitchen, served with flawless attention to detail. The table was perfectly set, the food meticulously arranged. She ate silently, her mind wandering as she picked at the eggs and toast, thinking about the events of the week. The people she had to meet, the parties she had to attend. It was all so polished, so demanding, and yet so isolating. He watched her for a moment, a slight frown appearing on his face. She knew that look well. It was the look he gave when something didn't align with his expectations. She felt a shiver of tension run down her spine, though she forced herself to keep her expression neutral. "Are you thinking about something?" he asked, leaning against the counter. His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it, subtle command that made her think twice about how she answered. "I was just thinking about the charity event this weekend," she said, keeping her voice light. She had learned long ago that answering honestly could be dangerous if it implied disapproval or hesitation. He nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. "I hope you understand the importance of it," he said finally. "It's not just a social event. It's a statement. Everything we do must reflect the image we have built." She nodded, pushing down the small pang of frustration she felt. She understood, of course. She had always understood, but sometimes she wished that understanding could be enough, that she could simply exist without constantly measuring every word, every action. Against his expectations, the morning passed in a series of precise, controlled movements. Meetings were held in the home office. Calls were answered with swift efficiency. Decisions were made with a decisiveness that left no room for hesitation. She watched it all from the sidelines, a quiet observer of a life that was both glamorous and confining. Despite the luxury surrounding her, she felt a strange emptiness. She had friends, acquaintances, people who admired her for her style, her charm, her association with him. Yet very few truly saw her. Very few knew her fears, her dreams, her doubts. She smiled, laughed, and attended events, but inside, she often felt like a spectator in her own life. In the afternoon, she went for a walk in the garden. The estate was vast, with perfectly manicured lawns, fountains, and flowers that bloomed in vibrant colors. Birds sang in the trees, and the air carried the faint scent of roses. Yet even in this serene setting, she felt a kind of tension, a reminder that freedom was never fully hers. She thought about the conversations she had with friends, carefully curated to reveal nothing that might upset him. Every word had to be measured, every action carefully considered. She longed for a moment of genuine spontaneity, something that was completely her own. But such moments were rare and fleeting as the day went on. He returned to the office, immersed in work that was both fascinating and exhausting. He was a man who thrived on control, on being the best, on achieving the impossible. And yet in his pursuit of power, She sometimes wondered if he saw the cost it had on the people around him, especially her. Evening came, and with it, another layer of performance. Guests arrived for a private dinner, people of influence, wealth, and status. She moved among them with grace, laughing at jokes, listening attentively, all while feeling a quiet distance from the conversations, a separation from the life she was expected to embrace fully. Her husband's attention shifted between her and the guests, a balancing act of charm and authority. He knew how to command a room, to make every person feel noticed, yet subtly aware of the hierarchy he maintained. She admired him for it in a way, but also resented the way it drew her into a world where her value was often measured by appearances rather than authenticity. Late that night, after the guests had left, she sat alone in the vast living room. The city lights sparkling outside the windows. She sipped a glass of wine, reflecting on the life she led. Luxury surrounded her, comfort and security were abundant, yet a deep longing for something real, something untainted by expectation, filled her heart. She thought about the woman she had been before this life, the dreams she had set aside, the spontaneity she had sacrificed for stability and status. There was a quiet rebellion growing inside her, a yearning for more than what was allowed, more than what was dictated by wealth and power. She didn't yet know how that rebellion would manifest, or what it might cost her, but the seed was planted. She was beginning to realize that the life she lived, as perfect as it seemed from the outside, was not entirely her own. And as she finally went to bed, the room dark and silent, she knew that change, when it came, would not be easy. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope that perhaps she could reclaim some part of herself. Some part of the freedom that had always seemed just out of reach. The morning light spilled through the tall windows again. But this time, it felt heavier, almost oppressive. She moved slowly, carrying a quiet tension in her shoulders that she couldn't shake. The day ahead promised meetings, calls, and social obligations. But there was something else lingering in the air. A sense that the delicate balance of her life was about to tip. She dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that would be appropriate for a luncheon she was attending. Her reflection in the mirror was flawless, as always. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, perfect posture. But beneath that polished exterior, she felt a storm brewing. She had begun to realize that the rules of her life were rigid, invisible walls that hemmed her in. Every decision, every interaction, was watched, evaluated, and subtly controlled. At breakfast, he entered with his usual confident stride, glancing around the kitchen with his eyes sharp and observant. He noticed everything, the arrangement of the cutlery, the way she held her coffee cup, even the tone in her voice when she greeted him. "Good morning," he said, voice calm but edged with expectation. "Good morning," she replied, forcing a soft smile. She knew that even small lapses, a casual tone, or a hint of hesitation could set off questions, criticisms, or worse, subtle threats. Today, she had plans to visit an art gallery, an event she had been looking forward to for weeks. She wanted to see the new exhibition, explore, breathe, and for a few hours, live outside the carefully scripted life she led. She'd even invited a close friend to join her, someone she trusted completely. But she knew she had to tread carefully. "Are you going out today?" he asked, leaning against the counter, arms crossed. His tone carried a faint, unspoken question, the kind that could make anyone uneasy. "Yes. I thought I'd visit the gallery," she said lightly. Trying to sound casual, he raised an eyebrow, his sharp gaze studying her. "With whom?" "Just a friend," she said, keeping it simple. "Make sure it doesn't interfere with your other commitments," he said finally. His words were calm, almost indifferent, but the undertone was unmistakable. There was always a subtle reminder. She was expected to prioritize his world above her own. She nodded quietly, sensing that any further explanation could lead to a lecture, a confrontation, or worse. Silence settled between them, heavy and uncomfortable. As she finished her coffee, once she left, she felt a rare sense of freedom, though it was fragile. Like a bird testing the wind before a flight. The city streets were alive, bustling with energy, colors, and movement. The gallery stood in a quiet corner, an oasis amidst the noise. She stepped inside, immediately enveloped by the calm, the muted light, and the soft hum of appreciation from other visitors. She wandered among the paintings, each brushstroke pulling her attention, each canvas telling a story. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to feel something entirely her own, something not filtered through the lens of someone else's expectations. Her friend arrived soon after, cheerful and talkative, providing a warm contrast to the tension she had carried all morning. They walked together, discussing art, life, and small dreams. For a brief period, she felt normal, human, free. But even in these moments, a shadow lingered in the back of her mind, a reminder of the world she would return to, a world filled with demands, control, and subtle threats. Later in the day, she received a message from her husband. It was brief, but pointed. "Remember your commitments. Don't forget your responsibilities." She sighed, feeling the familiar weight settle on her chest. Even when she was away, even when she tried to carve out space for herself, his presence loomed large, a silent overseer of her every action. When she returned home, the atmosphere had shifted. He was in the study, working, papers spread out in meticulous order. He looked up as she entered, his gaze sharp, measuring, evaluating. "We need to talk," he said, voice calm but firm. There was no question in the tone, only command. She nodded, her heart quickening. These conversations rarely ended in neutrality. They always carried a hidden edge, a test of her compliance or patience. He motioned for her to sit. She did, careful to maintain a composed posture. "I heard you went to the gallery today," he said, not as a question but as a statement. "And you went with a friend." "Yes," she replied softly, trying to keep her voice steady. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You know how I feel about distractions. We have a reputation to maintain. People watch us, and every action matters." She swallowed, feeling the tension tighten around her chest. She had anticipated this. But anticipating did little to ease the weight of his disapproval. "I understand," she said quietly. "I only wanted a small break. It was just for a few hours." He leaned back slightly, studying her. There was a long silence, broken only by the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. Then he spoke again, his tone sharper this time. "I hope you understand that even small actions can have consequences. Sometimes they go too far, even when you don't mean them to." Her stomach tightened. She felt a wave of fear, not from anger, but from the way his words carried an unspoken warning. She knew that his threats were rarely direct. They were subtle, calculated, and effective. He could make a comment, a look, or a suggestion, and it would ripple through her life, shaping her decisions without ever having to raise his voice. "I do understand," she said again, more firmly this time, trying to steady her shaking hands. "Good," he said finally. The moment passed, but the air remained thick with tension. She excused herself quietly, retreating to her private space, trying to calm the racing thoughts in her mind. That night, the social calendar demanded her presence again. A dinner party was held at their home, attended by influential figures from business, art, and politics. She moved through the rooms, greeting guests with warmth and charm, laughing at jokes, and maintaining the perfect posture of elegance. Yet beneath the practiced smiles, her mind replayed the conversation with her husband. The words, though subtle, had struck a nerve. She found a quiet corner for a brief moment of respite, taking a deep breath and letting her eyes wander over the opulent surroundings. Chandeliers sparkled above, the soft hum of conversation filled the room. And yet she felt an invisible barrier between herself and everyone else. No matter the beauty, no matter the wealth, no matter the admiration, there was a barrier she could not cross. After the dinner, she retreated to the private garden, the cool night air brushing against her face. The stars twinkled above, and for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to imagine a life different from this one. A life where she could make choices freely, where her thoughts and actions were her own, where she could breathe without caution or fear. But reality returned quickly. She remembered the weight of his gaze, the subtle threat in his words, the careful control he maintained over every aspect of their lives. She had lived long enough to know that stepping beyond the invisible lines he drew could have consequences she could not predict. The next day brought another layer of tension. He had scheduled a series of meetings in the home office, each more critical than the last. She had to attend, not as a participant, but as an observer, always careful to follow the script of his expectations. Even the smallest misstep, a delayed response, or an unintended expression, could invite scrutiny. As the day progressed, she noticed the subtle changes in his behavior. He was more impatient, his comments sharper, his eyes tracking her movements more carefully than usual. She realized that her brief assertion of independence, the gallery visit, the time with her friend, had not gone unnoticed. It had crossed a line in his mind, a line she was only beginning to understand. By evening, the tension reached a peak. He summoned her to the study again, his face serious, his presence commanding. "We need to be clear about boundaries," he said, voice calm but icy. "Actions have consequences, and sometimes threats are necessary to maintain order. I hope you understand this because we cannot afford mistakes." She nodded silently, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on her. This was the reality of the life she had chosen, or perhaps the life that had chosen her. Luxury, comfort, admiration, all came at the cost of personal freedom and constant vigilance. As she retired to her room that night, she felt a mixture of fear and determination. Fear of crossing the line again, fear of the subtle power he wielded, but also a quiet determination, a seed of resistance that had begun to grow. She would have to navigate this carefully, balancing the expectations, the control, and her own desire for independence. For the first time, she realized that the challenges ahead were not just about appearances or reputation. They were about her own courage, her ability to stand firm, and her willingness to reclaim even the smallest pieces of her life that had been overshadowed by control and subtle threats. And as she drifted into a restless sleep, the thought lingered in her mind. Freedom, even the smallest measure of it, might be the most valuable thing she had ever wanted, and the hardest to achieve. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain from the night before. She moved slowly, still haunted by the conversation from yesterday. The words that had lingered in her mind and refused to fade, the subtle threats, the carefully measured control, were not just whispers. They were warnings, reminders of the world she lived in, a world where even small gestures could have consequences. She dressed quietly, choosing a soft, neutral outfit, hoping to avoid attention. Today she was expected to attend a meeting with a group of influential investors at their home. It was one of those occasions where appearances mattered more than substance. Her presence was a statement, a symbol of sophistication, of unity, of the perfect life. And yet inside, she felt anything but perfect. As she entered the room where her husband was waiting, she noticed a sharp tension in his posture. He was reviewing documents, his brow furrowed, eyes scanning lines of text with the precision of a hawk. She had learned to read these signals. He was upset, and she knew that his mood would ripple through the entire day. "Good morning," she said cautiously, keeping her voice light. "Sit," he said, not looking up. His tone was curt, leaving no room for conversation. She obeyed, settling into the chair across from him, hands folded neatly on her lap. He finally looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. "I need to remind you," he said slowly, "that today's meeting is not just about business. It is about perception. Every word, every gesture, every reaction matters." She nodded, feeling the familiar tension tighten around her chest. She had heard this before, countless times, but somehow, the weight of it never grew lighter. After a brief moment, he continued, his voice dropping slightly, almost a whisper. "And let me be clear, disobedience, even small, can lead to consequences that are unavoidable." Her stomach sank. The words were not loud, not angry, not explosive, but they carried a weight far heavier than any shout. She had learned, over the years, that his calm threats were far more dangerous than fury. They were precise, calculated, and meant to instill a deep, lingering caution. "Yes," she said softly, forcing calm into her tone. The morning passed in a haze of rehearsed interactions and careful observation.
Oh.
She followed his instructions, smiled when necessary, laughed at jokes she didn't find amusing, and maintained a posture of perfection. Every glance from him was a reminder, one misstep, and the delicate balance she tried to maintain could shatter. By afternoon, the tension had grown unbearable. He called her into the study again, the sharp click of his heels on the polished floor announcing his presence before she even saw him. He didn't speak immediately, instead observing her, letting the silence stretch like a taut rope between them. Finally he spoke. "I have been thinking about yesterday, about your independence, about this friend. You need to understand that some actions go too far. Some choices can threaten everything we've built." She felt a tight knot form in her chest. She had anticipated disagreement, perhaps disapproval, but this felt heavier, more deliberate. The words carried the weight of a warning that had consequences far beyond mere words. "I only wanted a small break," she said quietly, hoping to sound reasonable, calm, innocent even. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, his tone deliberate. "Do you think small actions don't have impact? You may feel free, but freedom in the wrong place can be dangerous. Do not test the limits." She swallowed hard. His words were not threats, in the obvious sense, but she knew better than to doubt their meaning. In the past, even small defiance had led to subtle punishments, a withdrawal of attention, financial restrictions, isolation from social circles, or manipulations of people she trusted. The rest of the afternoon dragged on in a blur of obligations and forced interactions. She moved through their home as though through a labyrinth, constantly aware of his presence, constantly weighing her words and actions. Every smile, every nod, every step had to be measured. She felt the walls closing in, the space shrinking around her. That evening, she received a message on her phone. It was from her husband. "We need to discuss boundaries. Some actions are unacceptable." She read it twice, feeling a chill creep down her spine. She knew that tonight the conversation would go further than words, would carry a weight that might redefine her limits or at least push them to the edge. Dinner was quiet, almost painfully so. They ate together in the grand dining room, the chandeliers casting soft light over the polished table. He observed her, every movement, every bite, every glance. The silence was oppressive, filled with unspoken judgments and expectations. She felt her own heartbeat in the stillness, loud and insistent, a reminder of the anxiety he inspired. After dinner, he led her to the study. She followed quietly, aware that resistance, even in thought, was dangerous. Closed the door behind them, and the room seemed smaller, the walls closer, the air thicker. "You've been thinking you can act without consequences," he said, voice calm but with an unmistakable sharp edge. "That is a mistake." She nodded, keeping her voice low and steady. I understand." He walked around the room, eyes scanning the papers, the desk, and finally resting on her. "Understanding is not enough. You must internalize it. You must learn that choices, even small ones, can have far-reaching effects." She felt a surge of frustration, quickly tempered by fear. She had longed for independence, for the ability to make decisions, even trivial ones, without constant oversight. But the cost of stepping beyond his control was becoming frighteningly clear. "I will be careful," she said softly, trying to convey sincerity. He stopped, standing close, but not touching her. His eyes were intense, almost piercing, as though he could read every thought, every fear. "Careful is not enough. You must respect boundaries. You must understand that stepping too far can lead to irreversible actions." The words hung in the air like a storm ready to break. She knew he did not need to specify the consequences. The weight of his power, his control, his influence, spoke louder than any detail could. After a long silence, he finally turned away, walking to the window. The tension in the room did not dissipate. It lingered, pressing down on her chest, filling the space with an invisible weight. She left the study quietly, retreating to her room, trying to calm the whirlwind of thoughts and fears. That night, sleep was elusive. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every glance, every subtle warning from the day. Her mind raced with questions and anxieties. How far could she push? How much control could she exert over her own life? And what would happen if she crossed a line, even unintentionally? The next morning, the air felt heavier than usual. She tried to maintain composure, moving through the house with practiced elegance. But the tension from yesterday had settled into her bones, a quiet, persistent ache. Even small actions felt weighted, measured, and scrutinized. During breakfast, he spoke briefly but sharply. "Remember, some lines cannot be crossed. Do not test limits again." His words were calm, almost mundane, but the implication was clear. "Yes," she replied quietly, a shiver of fear running through her. She spent the day attempting to navigate the delicate balance of obedience and self-expression. Every conversation, every smile, every gesture was calculated, filtered through the lens of his expectations. Even in moments of quiet reflection, she felt the invisible gaze, subtle but ever-present pressure of his control. By evening, she could no longer ignore the tension building inside her. She walked through the garden, hoping the cool night air would calm her mind. The flowers, the fountains, and the soft rustle of leaves offered a temporary reprieve, but the fear and frustration remained. She realized that the days of subtle threats had evolved into a cycle of control, caution, and fear. She knew that if this continued, she would need to make a choice: continue to endure, bending to his will, or find a way to assert herself, even if it came with risk. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time, she felt the stirrings of defiance, a quiet strength growing beneath the fear. That night, as she prepared for bed, she reflected on the life she led. Luxury, influence, and admiration surrounded her, yet they came with chains invisible to anyone outside. The comfort she had once cherished now felt like a gilded cage. She understood that the path ahead would be difficult, fraught with tension, and possibly danger. But deep within, a spark of determination ignited. She would need to navigate carefully, weigh every step, and prepare for the consequences of independence. The subtle threats, the calculated warnings, and the unspoken rules had created a reality she could not ignore. And now, for the first time, she realized that reclaiming even a small measure of freedom would require courage, patience, and unwavering resolve. She closed her eyes, the darkness of the room enveloping her, but the spark inside her refused to fade. She knew that the days ahead would test her in ways she had never imagined. But she also knew that she could no longer ignore the voice inside. Her urging for freedom, for control over her own life, for a chance to live beyond fear. And so, she drifted into a restless sleep, the weight of yesterday pressing on her, but the promise of inner strength guiding her through the uncertainty of the days to come. The morning sunlight felt unusually bright, spilling into the bedroom with a sharp intensity. She moved slowly, carrying the weight of the previous days, the tension that had been building quietly, but relentlessly. Each glance, each word, each movement from her husband had layered pressure on her. A reminder that even the smallest misstep could have consequences she wasn't yet ready to face. She dressed carefully, picking an outfit that was elegant but understated. Today was different. She could feel it in the air, a subtle shift that set her nerves on edge. It wasn't just the usual meetings or social obligations. Something had changed. Something in the way he looked at her, something in the faint lines around his eyes. There was a storm brewing, and she sensed it before it arrived. As she entered the kitchen, he was already there, reviewing papers with his usual intensity. He looked up briefly, his gaze sharp, almost assessing her. She held her posture, keeping her voice calm. "Good morning," she said softly. "Good morning," he replied, without looking up. The words were simple, but the air between them was heavy, filled with the unspoken tension that had been growing day by day. Breakfast passed quietly, silence stretching between them like a taut rope. She felt it pressing on her chest, the weight of his unspoken expectations, the invisible line she could not cross. He spoke briefly about the day's schedule, outlining meetings and calls with a precision that left no room for deviation. She listened attentively, nodding when appropriate, careful not to draw attention to herself in any way that might be seen as a challenge. By mid-morning, she received a message from a friend she hadn't spoken to in months. It was simple, a casual invitation to meet for coffee. Her heart leaped, a mix of excitement and fear. It was a small act of independence, a chance to step out of the rigid framework that had been defining her life. Yet she knew that even this small gesture might trigger a reaction. She hesitated, weighing her options. Her fingers hovered over the reply button, her mind racing. Finally, she typed a short, polite response, agreeing to meet. The decision felt like a small rebellion, a quiet assertion of her will. But even as she did, a knot of fear formed in her stomach. She had learned that her husband's reactions could be unpredictable, and the stakes were high. When she returned home later that day, she could sense the tension before she even saw him. He was in the study, papers spread across the desk, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. She entered quietly, aware that the moment she stepped into the room, she would be under scrutiny. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but with an edge that made her stomach tighten. She nodded, sitting across from him as he leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "You went out today," he said, his tone steady but unmistakably serious, "with someone I do not approve of?" She swallowed hard, her mind racing. "It was just coffee, a brief meeting." "Nothing more," she said softly, trying to convey innocence and reason. He stared at her for a long moment, eyes sharp and unblinking. "Do you think such actions are without consequence? Or do you think the world does not notice? Or that I will not notice?" She shook her head, feeling the weight of his words press down on her. "I understand," she whispered. "Understanding is not enough," he said firmly. "You must internalize this. You must know that overstepping boundaries has results that are not always reversible. Actions like this, small as they may seem, can threaten everything." Her heart raced. She had anticipated disapproval, perhaps even anger, but this felt different. The calm, controlled tone carried more weight than shouting ever could. It was a warning, a declaration that the rules she had been following were not enough to protect her. "I will be careful," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear creeping in. "Good," he said. Finally, though his eyes remained fixed on hers, as if measuring every ounce of her sincerity. "You must remember, freedom is not granted lightly. It must be earned, and sometimes tested. But testing too far can have consequences you may not expect." The day continued with obligations, meetings, and appearances. She moved through them as always, maintaining grace and composure, smiling when expected, nodding when required, laughing at jokes that barely reached her ears. Yet beneath the polished exterior, a quiet storm of thoughts raged. She reflected on the tension of the day, the subtle threats, and the unspoken rules that governed her life. She realized that her desire for small moments of independence had been noticed, and it had provoked a reaction far beyond what she had imagined. That evening, a dinner party was held at their home, attended by influential figures. She moved through the rooms, engaging with guests with elegance, yet she could feel the invisible pressure pressing on her. Every word, every gesture, every glance had to be measured, filtered through the expectations that had been placed on her. She found brief moments of respite in quiet corners, taking deep breaths and reminding herself to remain calm as the night progressed. She noticed subtle changes in her husband's behavior. His attention was sharper, his remarks more pointed, his gaze tracking her more closely than usual. She realized that her small act of independence, the coffee meeting, had not only been noticed, but had crossed a line in his mind. The tension that had been simmering now felt palpable, a quiet storm ready to erupt. After the guests departed, she found herself alone in the garden, the cool night air brushing against her face. She walked among the flowers, letting the sound of rustling leaves and distant city hum calm her nerves. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a life where she could make choices freely, where her actions were not constantly scrutinized, where freedom was hers to hold. But reality returned quickly. She knew that the storm had not passed. The subtle threats, the warnings. And the careful control had created a landscape where even small acts of defiance were fraught with risk. She had to tread carefully, measure every step, anticipate the consequences of every decision. Later that night, he called her into the study again. She obeyed quietly, aware that resistance, even in thought, could provoke a reaction she was not ready to face. He did not speak immediately, instead observing her with eyes that seemed to pierce through her carefully constructed composure. Finally he spoke. "Do you understand the gravity of your actions today?" His voice was calm, but each word carried a weight that made her stomach tighten. "Yes," she said, keeping her voice low and steady. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You may believe your choices are small, insignificant, but in reality, even minor acts can have far-reaching consequences. You must remember this. I will not tolerate actions that threaten the balance we have created. And sometimes, words are not enough to ensure compliance." She felt a chill run down her spine. The words were a quiet threat, precise and deliberate. They did not need to be shouted. The implication was clear. Crossing a line, even unintentionally, could provoke actions beyond her control. "I understand," she whispered again, the words tasting hollow even as they left her lips. The rest of the night passed in a tense silence. She retreated to her room, the echo of his words lingering, a constant reminder of the delicate balance she had to maintain. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, every word, every glance. Fear mingled with determination, a quiet resolve that had begun to take root. She knew that the path ahead would not be easy. The subtle threats had grown more pronounced, the warnings more deliberate. She had to navigate a world where freedom was a privilege earned carefully, step by step, and where even the smallest assertion of independence carried risk. But deep inside, a quiet spark of defiance had begun to grow. She realized that she could no longer ignore the need to reclaim a part of herself, to assert even a small measure of autonomy. The challenges ahead were daunting, the consequences uncertain, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that change was possible. And as she drifted into sleep, the tension of the day pressing down on her, she clung to that spark, knowing that the storm would not last forever, and that eventually she would find a way to assert her freedom, no matter the cost. The morning sun entered the bedroom with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the tension she felt inside. The past weeks had been heavy, filled with subtle warnings, strict expectations, and carefully measured control. She had endured them quietly, balancing the need to comply with her growing desire for independence. But today felt different. Today felt like a turning point. She dressed slowly, choosing an outfit that was elegant but understated. There was a quiet determination in her movements, a careful strength that had been growing inside her. For the first time, she felt ready to act not recklessly, not defiantly for the sake of defiance, but with purpose. She needed to reclaim even a small piece of her life, a measure of control that had long been denied. At breakfast, her husband entered, as precise and commanding as ever. He glanced at her briefly, noticing the subtle change in her posture, the quiet confidence she carried. He said nothing at first, but she could feel the weight of his scrutiny, the sharp observation that had always kept her in check. "Good morning," she said calmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Good morning," he replied, voice even, but she sensed a faint tension beneath the surface. Perhaps he, too, felt that today would be different. After breakfast, she received a message from a friend, inviting her to a casual gathering later in the day. She paused, thinking carefully about her response. For weeks, even small social interactions had been monitored, criticized, or subtly controlled. But she knew she had to act, to assert her independence in a measured way. She typed a simple, polite reply, accepting the invitation. The act was small, almost insignificant to anyone else, but to her, it felt monumental. She was taking a step toward reclaiming her life, carefully navigating the lines she had learned to respect. Throughout the morning, she carried a quiet tension, aware that her actions might provoke a reaction. She moved through the house with elegance and composure, attending to obligations while keeping her mind focused on the plan she had formed. Her husband observed her, noting every gesture, every glance, every nuance of behavior. He sensed a change, though he could not yet define it. By afternoon, the time had come. She left the house for the gathering, each step deliberate, careful, yet filled with quiet determination. The city streets were alive with movement, colors, and sounds, and she felt a rare sense of freedom, even if only for a few hours. She met her friends, conversed, laughed, and allowed herself to enjoy the moment without fear or hesitation. For the first time in weeks, she felt fully present in her own life. When she returned home, the atmosphere had shifted. Her husband was waiting in the study, papers neatly stacked, posture rigid, eyes fixed on her. She could sense the tension, the anticipation, the quiet storm that had been building over weeks. She took a deep breath, preparing herself for the confrontation she knew was inevitable. "You went out today?" he said, voice calm but firm. "With people I do not approve of." "Yes," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "I went to meet friends. I wanted a small moment of my own." He studied her carefully, eyes sharp, measuring. "You understand the rules," he said finally. "You know the consequences of overstepping boundaries?" "I do," she said, voice steady. "But I also need to have some space, some freedom. I cannot live entirely under control. I need to make choices for myself, even small ones." There was a long silence. She held his gaze, unwavering, feeling the tension stretch between them. She sensed that this moment, this assertion, was critical. It was not a challenge born of anger, but a careful, deliberate act of self-respect. Finally, he spoke. "I see," he said quietly. His voice lacked the usual edge, the sharpness she had come to expect. "I have always believed control is necessary, that boundaries protect us and those around us. But perhaps I have underestimated your need for independence." She blinked, surprised. This was not the reaction she had expected. There was no fury, no punishment, no veiled threat. Instead, there was a pause, a reflection, a subtle acknowledgement of her perspective. "I never wanted to harm you or make you feel trapped," he continued. "I wanted to guide, to protect, but I see now that protection can feel like imprisonment." Her heart raced. This was the first time he had expressed understanding, even partially, for her feelings. She felt a cautious hope, a sense that the dynamic could shift, that the life she had been quietly yearning for could become possible. "I need to trust that you can make choices," he said finally. "I cannot control everything. And perhaps I do not need to." Tears welled in her eyes, not from fear, not from submission, but from relief. For weeks, she had felt the weight of control pressing down on her, the subtle threats, the careful monitoring. And now, for the first time, there was an acknowledgement that she mattered, that her autonomy was valid, that her voice could be heard. The days that followed were filled with careful negotiation. They began to redefine their relationship, learning to balance control and freedom, power and respect. He remained the same in many ways, decisive, precise, influential, but there was a new awareness, a subtle shift in how he viewed her choices, her actions, her independence. She, in turn, approached life with a renewed sense of self. She continued to attend social events, pursue interests, and maintain the image expected of them. But she did so with confidence, knowing that her choices carried weight, that her voice mattered. The fear that had lingered for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet strength that had grown over weeks of tension and reflection. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, the city lights twinkling in the distance, she realized how far they had come. The tension that had once defined every interaction had eased, replaced by a cautious respect, an understanding that had been absent for so long. "You have grown stronger," he said quietly, watching her carefully. "Stronger than I gave you credit for." "I had to," she replied softly. "I had no choice but to find my own strength." He nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "And I had no choice but to see it." In that moment, the weight of the past weeks seemed to lift slightly. The subtle threats, The warnings, the tensional of it, had led to this turning point. They had confronted the reality of their lives, their fears and their desires. And in doing so, they had found a new path. One that allowed space for both respect and independence. She knew the journey was far from over. Life would continue to demand appearances, obligations, and careful navigation. But for the first time, she felt a sense of control, quiet assurance that she could assert herself without fear of reprisal. She had learned the value of measured courage, the power of quiet defiance, and the importance of standing firm even in the face of subtle threats. The billionaire she had once feared so deeply had shown a side of himself that few had seen: vulnerability, reflection, and an unexpected willingness to change. And she, in turn, had discovered a strength within herself that no wealth, no control, and no threat could diminish. That night, as she prepared for bed, she reflected on the journey she had undertaken. From fear to quiet defiance, from subtle control to measured independence. She had navigated a path that tested her patience, courage, and resilience. And though challenges remained, she knew she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined to live life on her own terms. As she drifted into sleep, the tension of the past weeks finally gave way to a sense of peace. The subtle threats had lost their power, replaced by understanding and mutual respect. She had faced the storm and found her own strength within it. And for the first time in a long while, she felt the quiet joy of knowing that freedom, even measured and careful, was hers to hold. The journey was not over, but she had taken the first, most important steps. She had reclaimed herself, her voice, and her choices. And in doing so, she had reshaped the world around her, showing that even in the presence of power, control, and subtle threats, courage and determination could carve a path to freedom, respect, and understanding. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the soft glow of the city, she felt truly alive, ready to face whatever the future held, confident in her ability to stand firm, and certain that her life, finally, was hers to live. The days after the turning point felt different. Lighter in some ways, yet still full of challenges. She had reclaimed a small measure of freedom, a space where she could breathe without fear. But life was not magically free of tension. Even with understanding between them, old habits and expectations lingered. Subtle yet persistent reminders of the life she had endured. She woke up one morning to the soft hum of the city below, sunlight spilling gently through the curtains. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of calm, though it was accompanied by a cautious awareness. She knew that asserting independence was not a one-time act. It required ongoing vigilance, patience, and careful negotiation. After dressing for the day, she entered the kitchen to find breakfast prepared as usual. Her husband was already there, reading documents with his characteristic precision. He looked up briefly, his eyes meeting hers with a faint approving smile. It was a small gesture, but it carried significance. The acknowledgement of her presence, her agency, had become part of their new understanding. "Good morning," she said, returning the smile softly. "Good morning," he replied. His tone was even calm, but there was a subtle warmth that had been absent in earlier days. It was the kind of warmth that comes from respect rather than obligation. It's from recognition rather than control. The morning passed with the usual activities, calls, meetings, and correspondence. Yet today, she noticed a difference. She participated in conversations, offering her opinions, making decisions, and observing the respect in the way people responded to her. It was a small change, but it reinforced her sense of agency, the knowledge that she could act without immediate repercussions. By midday, she received a message from a longtime friend, inviting her to a casual lunch. She paused, considering it carefully. In the past, even small social interactions had been scrutinized, criticized, or subtly restricted. Today, however, she felt empowered to accept. Knowing she could negotiate her time and space with confidence, she agreed to the lunch, meeting her friend at a quiet cafe. The hours they spent together were filled with laughter, conversation, and shared memories. She felt a rare sense of authenticity, a connection that had been difficult to achieve in recent months. For the first time in a long while, she could speak freely, express thoughts without filtering every word, and enjoy the moment without fear of judgment. When she returned home, the atmosphere had shifted slightly but positively. Her husband was in the study, yet there was no tension, no unspoken warnings. He looked up from his work and nodded in acknowledgement. "I trust you to manage your time," he said, simple words, yet heavy with meaning. She felt a wave of relief. This trust, even in small measures, was monumental. It was a sign that the patterns of control could be altered, that mutual respect could coexist with influence and responsibility. She realized that the path to freedom was gradual. Built on small victories and ongoing negotiation, the evening brought another, a formal gathering at their residence. Attended by influential figures from business and society, she prepared carefully, choosing an outfit that was elegant yet understated. She moved through the event with poise, engaging in conversation, sharing opinions, and enjoying herself without fear of overstepping boundaries. The subtle shifts in her husband's approach were evident. He no longer scrutinized every word or gesture. Instead, he allowed her space, offering quiet support when necessary. During the gathering, she found herself in a conversation with a new acquaintance, someone who was intrigued by her presence, her intelligence, and her insights. For the first time in months, she felt her voice carry weight, her thoughts valued for their own merit rather than filtered through his authority. The realization was empowering, a validation of her growing confidence and resilience. After the guests departed, they retreated to the garden, the city lights sparkling in the distance. The air was cool, carrying the scent of flowers and the faint hum of the city. She walked among the plants, feeling the calm settle over her. Her husband joined her quietly, standing a few steps away. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said softly, voice measured but sincere. "I saw your confidence, your presence. It was impressive." She smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest. "Thank you," she replied. "I felt free to be myself, and that made all the difference." He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "I am learning too," he said quietly, "to let go, to trust, to recognize that respect and independence are part of who you are, not a threat to what I am." The moment was simple, yet profound. Weeks of tension, fear, and subtle control had given way to understanding, mutual respect, and a quiet partnership. It was not perfection, but it was real, human, and transformative. The days that followed were filled with careful balance. She continued to navigate social obligations, personal interests, and the expectations of their shared life. Yet now, she did so with confidence, knowing that she had agency, that her voice mattered, and that her choices carried weight. The subtle threats that had once loomed over her life had been replaced by acknowledgement, negotiation, and mutual understanding. One afternoon, she found herself reflecting on the journey. The tension, the fear, the careful observation, all of it had shaped her resilience, her courage, and her ability to assert herself. She realized that true strength did not come from avoiding challenges or appeasing authority, but from understanding boundaries, asserting autonomy, and cultivating respect through actions and communication.